Any health-related information on the following show provides general information only. Content presented on any show by any host or guest should not be substituted for a doctor's advice. Always consult your physician before beginning any new diet, exercise, or treatment program.
Welcome to Accelerated Health with Sara Banta. Today, you're not going to want to miss it. We're talking about the newest cutting edge way to lose your fat, right? And that's what we're all trying to do. Well, we have an amazing guest back. And today we're also going to cut through the noise, fast track your journey to better health, get through the myths versus facts. I'm your host, Sara Banta, CEO and founder of Accelerated Health Products and certified by the National Association of Nutritional Professionals. I am here 3 times a week to share my latest on supplements, wellness hacks, and natural health solutions that actually work, from boosting energy to detoxing to balancing hormones and everything in between. I will help you reach your optimal health. So we are going to dive in. We've got Jay Feldman back, one of my favorite guests, because he's so knowledgeable, he's cutting edge, and he's researching. Imagine that. Actually basing his knowledge on research. Jay is a health coach, independent health researcher, and the host of the Energy Balance podcast. Highly recommend you subscribe because the nuggets he gives are unlike anyone else. He uses the bioenergetic approach to help men and women around the world maximize their cellular energy, optimize their health, and achieve freedom from low energy symptoms. Welcome, Jay. How are you?
I'm good. Yeah. Thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
Well, we're going to talk about fat loss biohacks, myths and versus what really works. And I actually just came across Keto 2.0. And it's like we have to reinvent these new diet trends that falter, right? There's the low carb, the carnivore, the vegan, the vegetarian, and now the sugar diet, which we're going to get into, which is the exact opposite. But, back for our ancestors and for even my grandparents' age, they were just eating real food. And there was no obesity. There was not this disease that we have today. And I feel like everyone is just trying to find a hack to get away from just eat real food in a balanced way, get away from the toxins and eat like our ancestors did. But instead, we're cutting out a whole food group to try to get to a solution and reduce inflammation, reduce that obesity and the metabolic disease. So I am super excited to dive into all of it. And I just don't even know where to start. I mean, number one, the myth of eating less and moving more, right? Why that doesn't work.
Yeah. And I think that's the basis for so many of the diets out there, and really the starting place culturally when it comes to weight loss, right? That's the kind of baked in assumption that if we're overweight, the problem is excess energy. And so we just need to eat less so that we have less of that energy coming in, and we need to burn more off with exercise, and then we'll lose weight. And there's a couple of problems with that. The first being that we know long-term, it's pretty ineffective. The vast majority of diets fail. And there are studies showing that the average woman, by the time that she's in her 60s, she'll have tried over like 50 diets, something crazy like that. And all the numbers show that over 90% of the diets fail when you look past, I want to say like 2 years. A lot of times there's the short-term weight loss and the weight is back on. And so we know they aren't very effective as far as keeping weight off. So that's one concern. The other one is that this is operating on missing, I should say, a huge factor, and really the factor that drives weight gain. And that's problems with utilizing the fuel that's coming in. So there's this assumption baked in to this approach, which is that if you are overweight, the problem is you've had too much fuel and it was all converting to energy, and now you're full of energy, and so you're going to store that excess fuel as fat. The reality is that so many things in our environment block our ability to effectively use the fuel that's coming in, whether we're talking pesticides, whether we're talking nutrient deficiencies, whether we're talking stress, whether we're talking a lack of sunlight, so many other factors. And so when we're inundated with these things and our food supply is just destroyed and nowhere near the quality that it used to be, we have impairment in converting the food that's coming in into energy. So what happens is you take in the same amount of food, you end up with less energy, less ATP. Our mitochondria are not able to work well. And then because we can't convert that extra fuel to energy, we have to store it as body fat. So we're left in this state of both things happening at once, where not only do we have the excess weight, but also we have low energy, not just energy in terms of energy to do things throughout the day, although that's a part of it. But the other part is energy that we need to have good focus, to have good digestion, to have good immune function, to have good reproductive hormones and reproductive function, and everything else from there. It's all dependent on energy. If we don't have enough of that energy, we have to turn down all of our different bodily functions so that we can survive. So that's the place that so many of us find ourselves in. And then the suggestion of just eat less food or burn extra off might lead to some weight loss in the moment, but it'll leave us with less energy. And in the long term, what our bodies do when they're chronically energy deficient is they say, I need to turn down my metabolic rate. I need to spend less energy on all those functions. And I need to store the fuel coming in as body fat so that way I can survive the incoming stress. I'm expecting lots of stress. I'm expecting a lack of energy and fuel coming in. I need to store that as body fat so that I can survive, right? That's a built-in biological function that we have. If we were going through a famine, we don't want to keep our metabolic rate really high because we would starve and die. And instead we kind of pseudo hibernate. We decrease our bodily function so that we can survive during those periods. And we try to put on body fat in that process. So that advice has gotten us to where we are now with skyrocketing obesity and autoimmune conditions and basically every chronic health condition you could think of. And yeah, it's certainly not the ideal approach when it comes to weight loss or health.
Well, and I want to stress the fact that when you are restricting, regardless of what dietary plan you're following, your body senses more stress. More stress in addition to the stress of the toxins, the pesticides, the GMOs, the glyphosate, the viral activity, the additional mold and parasites that we're seeing, all these things that are stressors that are going to cause that survival mode to be triggered. But then you're on top of that, you're saying, body, I'm not going to give you what you're asking for. And that stress is going to increase. And there's an extra layer of this. I need to store extra fat. I'm going to slow the metabolic rate down. I'm going to shut down the thyroid, all the things. And it's whether you're doing the keto diet and you're shutting or you're cutting out the carbs. See, this is what I need people to understand is you inherently probably are going to eat less on any of these diets because you are cutting out a whole food group. And so you're naturally going to start eating less until you then say, wait a second, now I need to eat even more because I'm not getting the energy and my body is under a stress state. So you're probably going to lose a little weight initially, short term, with any of these plans. Veganism, people start feeling better for 6 months because they're not eating the processed foods. They're not going to McDonald's. They're not going to Taco Bell. They're cutting out a whole food group. But then after about 6 months, the body says, wait a second, where's my protein? Where's some of the things, the nutrients that I used to get from my animal? And then the stress sets in and then your body starts craving more food because it's not getting the nutrients it needs. And so it triggers, cravings because you are going to crave until your body says, I'm safe, I'm getting enough, I'm happy. Am I missing anything there?
I mean, that's, I think, a really great summary. And the hunger and cravings is such a huge part of it. I mean, most people, I would say in like modern Western culture with all the dieting that's just life, right? Life is restriction and cravings that we're always fighting against, right? That chronic reliance on willpower that's just, I think, baked into what people experience every day. And there was a period of time where I experienced that myself as well, when I was operating under the same perspective. And there's a huge cost to that mentally. I mean, there's so much that we're missing out on. But also, I mean, it is a chronic weight, right? And it's a heavy one, just 24/7. So when we are able to recognize that if we actually fix the root of the issue, if we fix our ability to produce energy from the fuel coming in, not only can we have better energy and sleep better and, improve mood and anxiety and digestion and all of the rest and lose weight, but also we can do that without feeling like we need to chronically restrict, without basically, preventing our body from getting what it's needing and asking for. Because as you said, there's built-in mechanisms. When we restrict some essential nutrient for our bodies, there's built-in mechanisms that say, I want that, let's have some of that. And so this idea of just picking and choosing one essential nutrient or one macronutrient over another that we're going to keep out, I mean, it's just different forms of depriving our bodies of what they need. And there's a major cost to that, both in how we feel and then also the physiological effects.
Right. Well, I want to start with the keto diet and then we'll get into the opposite of the keto diet, the sugar diet. But why did people attach themselves to the keto diet for fat loss? Why did it work? And then why long-term did it start failing people? Because it's out of favor now. And they're even, like I said, coming out with Keto 2.0, which is just a nice way of saying, oh, it's a little more balanced approach, which more aligns probably with what you and I talk about. But it's just funny how they have to give it a new name and make it a new trend and reinvent it just so that we have something more to sell. And all of the keto products out there can still sell, right? So what is it about the keto diet that works initially? And then where are the mechanisms faltering long-term?
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. So there's a couple of mechanisms through which it works initially and can have some real benefits. The first one, which can happen on pretty much any diet, is that when we're going on to a diet, especially one that's restricting an entire macronutrient or that is just very different from the diet we're doing, we're going to cut out a lot of the quote unquote bad foods that we're already eating. Typically, we're going to be cutting out a lot of those processed foods. If we were relying really heavily on grains, wheat, pizza, pasta, bread, all those kinds of things, we're cutting those out when we go low carb or keto, and that alone is beneficial, right? We know that we would get benefits even just by cutting those things out and shifting toward a more whole food based diet. And that's it's not necessarily the processing that is the issue. It's how these things are processed, right? If we're talking about just cutting potatoes, frying them in coconut oil and adding a little bit of salt and putting that in a bag, that's fine. But if instead we're talking about the ridiculous chemical processing that has to happen to produce canola oil or soy oil, and then we're mixing that in with the processing that goes on with grains and added vitamins and minerals, many of which are in the wrong forms, which then cause other problems. I mean, those are two different beasts, even though you could say they're both processed. So it's not just the processing itself, it's how are these things processed, what are the ingredients and all of that. But so that's part one. We're taking out things that are not healthy for us. That's kind of the simplified version of it. The second one is one of the biggest drivers of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, weight gain, which of course goes hand in hand with obesity, and autoimmune conditions, so many other issues come back to the gut. So our gut health and poor gut health is really one of the main drivers for those disease processes. The reason for that is because the bacteria that are in our gut produce various toxic compounds that when we absorb them are basically directly poisonous to our mitochondria and prevent us from producing energy from the food coming in. They directly drive an inflammatory state and cause everything from fatty liver to plaque development and cardiovascular disease. So the gut side of things is massive. And we see what's called metabolic endotoxemia. So one of the main toxins produced by the guts is called endotoxin. The chemical name is lipopolysaccharide. And elevated levels of lipopolysaccharide are seen in diabetes, obesity, and on from there. And it's known to be a major driver in these disease states. One of the main things that causes more production of this is if we're consuming carbohydrates that we aren't effectively digesting, and we already have bacterial imbalance, and those carbohydrates are feeding the bacteria. And that causes an increase in endotoxin production, which causes intestinal permeability. It causes leaky gut. We absorb that endotoxin, and we're seeing havoc wreaked everywhere. And so that's the second biggest one, is that we're cutting out the food or the types of foods, the category of foods that are most likely to feed those bacteria when we have a bacterial imbalance. So relief from that can be massive. I mean, you see this, you see legitimate benefits on these diets in terms of autoimmune conditions and brain fog and neurodegenerative conditions and insulin resistance. And those are real benefits, I would say, largely due to these first two things we've talked about, cutting out bad foods and not feeding the bacteria and not producing endotoxin. And they see this in studies where you can provide an antibiotic and put, the rodents or mice or primates, into a state that would cause fatty liver disease, but you provide the antibiotics, cut out the endotoxin, and it doesn't happen. So we know that this is a major, major driver of these disease states, and we know that that's one of the primary reasons, probably the biggest reason, why these diets provide benefit. And as I was saying, it is a true benefit. Like, it is great to have that. But as we'll get to, we can do that without the cost to our health, without the stress that's driven by the lack of carbohydrates. And that's really what we want to do. So I would say those are the two primary reasons. And then one other reason that I have to mention very briefly is that when our mitochondria are blocked, we tend to have problems metabolizing glucose. We can't convert those carbohydrates to energy. That's what we call insulin resistance. If we take out the glucose, if we take that out of the equation and just provide fat and start to produce some ketones, we aren't going to have as much of an issue. The things that tend to block energy production are more impactful on glucose metabolism. It's more sensitive to those sorts of things. So we can run on fat relatively effectively. And so in this state, we're already dealing with these metabolic issues. We can just cut the glucose out and not fix our ability to utilize it, but just avoid it. And we'll see some benefits from that too. But there is some major costs, and we're not actually fixing the underlying problem of not being able to use those carbohydrates. So that's kind of the positives we get when it comes to low carb and keto diets.
So I always talk about the fact that you don't use it, you lose it. Like if you're not going to the gym and you're going to the gym, you're only doing leg day and you're not doing arm day, you're going to have skinny arms and you're not going to use those muscles. Well, if you don't use the muscle to burn glucose for energy, your body's going to say, I don't need to learn how to do this. I don't need to know how to do this. And I've had so many friends and clients say, I've been on keto for years and I just have one meal with carbs and I blow up. And it's because your body's like, hey, wait a second. What is this? I'm not used to this. But what else is it doing long-term to thyroid function, to metabolism? And then if you could touch on the liver health, because what I'm seeing is due to the spike protein, due to the toxicity, just increasing and increasing and increasing, our livers are so backed up, they can't process the fat and the proteins like they used to. So a high-fat diet might backfire even initially on somebody, and you might feel nauseous and actually gain weight from that excess fat because your liver doesn't know what to do with it. So if you could talk about some of the side effects long-term of keto.
Yeah, definitely. And you brought up a great point, which is someone's on keto and then they go eat a meal with carbs. And normally it's not just eating some fruit or some white rice. It's pizza, it's donuts, things that don't just have carbs. They have a lot of fat too. But it's not normally the healthy things. And then they don't have a good response and they say, oh, it's the carbs, of course.
Right.
But even so, even if someone does maybe eat some potatoes, sweet potatoes, or fruit, they still might have some negative effects. And as you said, it's because when we're in that state, we've shifted everything toward being able to utilize fats and still absorb protein as well. But the ability to digest and absorb carbohydrates is downregulated, and the ability to convert those to energy is downregulated as well, because we've shifted all of our mitochondria, our enzymes, our hormones toward fat burning and ketone production. So when we're adding carbs in, and this is well known, if someone takes what's called an oral glucose tolerance test when they're on a low carb diet, they're going to fail miserably, meaning that their body's not going to use the glucose well, and it's going to look like they have diabetes. The reality is that this is just a temporary state while you're on a low carb diet. But what that means is when you do want to add carbs in, you have to do so slowly and carefully in transition so that your body has the opportunity to make those adaptations that it needs to make. So that's a great point. But as you were saying, the bigger concern here is what's happening long-term on these diets. We might have some of these notable benefits, but what are the drawbacks here? Why don't we want to go that route? And the primary one is that when we're avoiding carbohydrates and we're taking that shift over to fat as our main fuel, our bodies recognize that as another sign of scarcity, as a sign of famine, like we were talking about earlier. Our carb availability in our environment is kind of the most fickle. It's the one that changes the most. And so when we're in a really abundant environment with a lot of carbohydrates, our bodies recognize that. They drive up their metabolic state using thyroid hormone production and reproductive hormone production like testosterone and progesterone, and keeping the stress hormones down. But when we don't, and the blood sugar starts to drop due to that lack of carbohydrate, we start to produce a little bit of stress hormones. And then if we continue to not have carbohydrate, we produce more and more. And what those stress hormones do is they start to increase the production of carbohydrate from protein, from amino acids, and they start to shift us toward burning more fat. And this is the first step that we have of adapting to a lack of carbohydrates. And it's great that we can do this. It allows our body to function when there's not carbohydrates available, but there's an inherent metabolic cost. So when this happens, the stress hormones here, and there's three in particular that are most involved. There's glucagon, epinephrine or adrenaline, and cortisol. And in that process of increasing gluconeogenesis to produce carbohydrates from our amino acids, in the process of shifting us over toward burning more fat and producing more ketones, they also turn down our metabolic rate by reducing the production of thyroid hormones from the thyroid gland, reducing the conversion of thyroid hormones, the inactive T4 to the active T3, which largely happens in the liver and peripheral tissues, and also turning down the production of reproductive hormones like testosterone and progesterone. Those are really the main places, the main kind of switches on a global sense where these hormones are having impacts that are going to slow down our metabolic rate. There's also some inherent effects where when the mitochondria, the engines, are using fat as a fuel instead of carbohydrates, they have to run slower unless they're driven by stress. So that's another factor that actually slows the metabolic rate as well in the long term. So all of those things together lead to slower metabolism, meaning we're eating less and less and maintaining our weight, right? We're able to maintain our weight eating less food, which is not something that we actually want. And then at the same time, the downregulation of our metabolism starts to take a toll. We start to see those downstream effects. We start to maybe have trouble falling asleep, or we start to wake up during the night. We're maybe experiencing more anxiety. The cravings, of course, can get out of control at times. We might start to feel lethargic, might see the libido drop. The digestive symptoms might start to come back, maybe due to other issues, not actually due to the carb-related bacteria. But as you said, maybe we're starting to have liver issues that's leading to trouble with digesting fats, for example, right? We're not having good bile flow due to all the stress that's gone on at the liver due to the lack of carbohydrates. So we start to see these things crop up. And a lot of times those symptoms, those improvements that we might have noticed early on, they start to rear their head again. And oftentimes they're far worse. And we've, in the process, dug ourselves into this metabolic hole that then we have to dig out of. And that's not always a fun process and can be a treacherous one. But yeah, that's the kind of downstream long-term effects that we're seeing from these diets.
And not to mention the fact that it's hard to sustain this type of diet. And if you stop getting the results, then you really are not going to sustain the diet because you're going to give up and you're not going to reach for the apple. You're going to reach for the Ben and Jerry's, which is, so when you're talking about carbs, people tend to not reach for those whole food carbs. They're reaching for the processed foods that are going to destroy your mitochondria and ATP and cause the brain fog, cause the quick weight gain, all the things all at once. And then you give up, you're depressed, and the wheels come off. So the opposite of this is the sugar diet, the honey diet. So everyone's like, okay, I couldn't do the keto diet. I actually like sugar. This is right up my alley. I don't need fat. I don't like fat. I actually don't even like eating protein. I'm going to just focus on sugar. And this is my diet. And growing up, I mean, I was eating a very low fat diet and high carbs, high sugar. but it wasn't real carbs. It was the processed carbs, and my brain suffered. And my hormones were off, all the things. I don't think that's what this is. So it is going crazy now. Let's talk about it. What is it? What kind of foods are they focused on? What is the mechanism that's at work? And, does it work short term and then long term falters? Or is this something, Jay, that is actually going to stick around?
Yeah, that one will definitely have to see. We'll have to wait and see. But I think at least parts of it will. I think it will in a way. So backing up, I mean, big picture, basically within the kind of diets, and there's a few different ones. There's the sugar diet is really the biggest one, but there's the honey diet and the fruit till noon diet and a couple others that are all based on the same framework that actually came out of the bioenergetic perspective, where we recognize the benefits of carbohydrates and keeping those stress hormones down. But there was people who were looking for maybe quicker weight loss, or they were just doing different experiments, looking at the research, and basically came across seeing research looking at the benefits of potentially low fat diets, and then also looking at low protein diets, and that they can increase the metabolic rate. And basically, the idea being that if we hack those mechanisms, we can lose weight quickly and effectively. So that's kind of the broad picture. And the first thing I want to say is I'm excited to see these things catch on. I think it's been well over a decade at this point, maybe 15 to 25 years of the alternative health space being dominated by high fat, low carb diets. And the idea being that the carbs are the problem. They're causing metabolic syndrome. They're causing obesity and insulin resistance. They're causing heart disease. They are the cause of all of the problems. And so it's exciting to see that narrative start to shift a little bit. And I really hope that catches on and that's here to stay. So that's the first thing. However, as you were getting at, there's some inherent restriction that goes on here, right? We're talking about basically utilizing very low fat and potentially very low protein diets, depending on how they're done. Some of the diets are doing basically no protein until dinner. Some are, involved going for several days of doing like a fast without any protein or fat and doing only sugar-based things during that time, honey and fruits and juices, but also table sugar based things, high fructose corn syrup based things. So, and again, I think there's a really great part about that too, which is recognizing that the table sugar is not the problem. Obviously, we don't want that to be the bulk of our diet. It's not ideal, but that hasn't been the issue. That hasn't been the thing that's been causing these metabolic problems. But so that's kind of the framework for these diets. And on one hand, I think we're seeing them have benefits in terms of weight loss and in terms of people feeling energetic. A lot of the actual effects that people are noticing on these diets are the same ones that we talked about with keto and low carb diets, where initially, especially, people are losing a lot of weight. They're feeling a lot more clear-headed. They have better energy. They're noticing, sleep improvements as well. And I would say one of the main reasons for that is the very low fat diets do help to support insulin resistance. And in somebody who is very insulin resistant, dropping the fat down can be beneficial to an extent. There's a point where we start to really incur some stress. And it's also important to note that for somebody who is far less insulin resistant, we wouldn't want to drop the fat as low. And that'll come at a greater cost to our hormonal health and digestive health and blood sugar stability. So there's kind of that cost benefit there to an extent. But anyway, there's support for this supporting insulin resistance. Dropping the fat can help with that. And on the protein side, we actually have a very similar mechanism to low carb. And this is one that I didn't touch on as much. But when we have the initial shift into low carb and even ongoing after that, there's a major increase in stress, like we talked about. And stress can feel good. When we wake up and have a cup of coffee, just a cup of black coffee, we're energetic. Our mood is up. We can focus. We can go do a workout. We have a lot of energy. And this is why people use, things like caffeine for pre-workouts and various other supplements and things like that. It's because the stress helps you feel good. But stress doesn't come, for free. There's a crash involved. Sometimes that crash is a couple hours later, or sometimes it's months or years later if we're really chronically dealing with that stress. And so that's what we saw in the low carb diets. And there's a major aspect of that here on these high carb, low protein, and low fat diets. when we drop the protein as low as they're talking about here, it activates a hormone called FGF21, which is kind of unique to protein deficiency. It's kind of like its own system that responds to protein deficiency, and it says basically we don't have enough protein and amino acids coming in. We have to stop building protein. We have to stop using amino acids to build more proteins, and we have to eat more to get more protein in. So what it actually does is it increases our desire to consume protein, understandably so, and it increases our metabolic rate so we can burn off the extra other fuel we have, and we can go out and get more protein and eat more because we're eating a protein deficient diet. So it's a pretty unique hormone in that way. But in the way that it upregulates our metabolism to burn off the extra fuel, that is mediated by stress. It's causing the same type of stress that we're seeing on these low carb diets, where yes, in the short term, you might see an increase in the metabolic rate, and that might cause some weight loss. But in the long term, we are depleting the energy that our bodies need, that we need to have available for all of our functions, and we will turn down our metabolic rate in the long term. And that's what we see with long-term effects of elevated FGF21 and low protein diets in the research.
Can I stop you real quick
yeah,
there? Because this is so confusing. So if this is stopping that protein synthesis, your body's going to start eating away at its muscles, I would assume. And when you say weight loss, you're not saying fat loss. So you're losing muscle and fat at the same time. Would that be correct?
Potentially, yes. And that's one of the biggest concerns. And it's not just muscle, but also bone, because FGF21, as that increases, it actually tends to lead to bone loss and muscle loss. So that is one of the biggest concerns here, is we're not just going to be losing body fat, but we'll also be losing that lean mass. Now, when we're eating a lot of carbs, we're not doing a full fast, but we're eating lots of carbohydrates, that will reduce the amount of muscle loss, because we aren't converting those amino acids to glucose. We're not breaking down the muscle just to produce glucose. So there's less breakdown going on there, which is great, but we still don't have the protein needed for just the regular turnover in the muscles, right? And it's not just the muscles, it's every organ in our body is built on mostly protein and fat as well. And so when we are in this state, we're preventing our capacity to properly repair from the normal breakdown, like the normal usage of all of our organs and including our muscles. So if we're on a chronically low protein diet, we're much more prone to losing muscle mass and bone mass. Now, some of these diets do include some versions of like protein refeeding, or the idea being that with dinner, you're going to eat more protein. And so there you could start to rebuild some of your muscle. And that definitely is happening to some extent, but we're basically putting ourselves in the negative and then just trying to get back to balance and hoping that we do. We don't know that we're actually going to get back to that balance. We're just hoping that that's the case and there's not going to be a net loss over time, like the research shows. But on top of that, we're not giving ourselves the opportunity to build into the positive, right? We want to be able to build and regenerate and improve our complexity. We don't want to constantly be breaking ourselves down and just getting back up, hopefully, to where we were and not even knowing if we're really doing that, because we know the long-term effects of things like intermittent fasting, even when we're having protein, during that 8-hour window, but we're fasting for 16 hours, that shows increased loss of muscle mass. So right. We're probably not going to be able to rebuild all the way and actually get all the way back up, especially when we're doing this long-term. So for someone, just real quick, for someone who's like maybe obese or dealing with type 2 diabetes, I think you're probably going to be losing a very large portion of body fat, and I wouldn't be as concerned about a small amount of lean mass loss. And there's a lot of carbs coming in that should mitigate that. But if that's not us, then I would especially be worried. I would especially be concerned about losing muscle mass and bone mass.
Well, it reminds me of the intermittent fasting, or OMAD, where people say, well, it doesn't matter when I eat my protein, as long as I get it in during that day. It doesn't have to be right after my workout. But the problem is, if you're having one meal a day with protein, whether it's fasting or eating sugar up until that point, how are you able to eat as much protein as you need to sustain you in one meal? I mean, for the typical man, that's 150 to 200 grams of protein in one meal. That's a lot of protein. And can your body process it? And for women, I mean, most listeners are women in perimenopause and menopause, and we are having a tough enough time already to maintain muscle mass and let alone build muscle mass during these hormonal changes. So it makes me a bit concerned about the long-term effects of that, rebuilding our tissues. And it's not just muscle, it's the hair, it's the skin. I mean, us women, we're plumping Botox and fillers in. Why don't we just eat the protein to help with collagen and the elastin of our skin? And we're losing hair because our thyroid's plummeting. And this can't be good for the thyroid mechanisms, just like any extreme diet. So maybe you can talk a little bit about long term. Are we seeing, or maybe we don't even know yet, what the impact is on our thyroid hormones?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and when we're looking long term at the effects of protein deficiency and of severely low fat diets, we do see negative effects to the reproductive health. In the studies on rodents, they see infertility, and in terms of and then they also see loss of muscle mass and those kinds of concerns as well. And we do see pretty ubiquitously, like comprehensively throughout the research, that very low fat diets tend to lead to lower testosterone, lower dihydrotestosterone or DHT. So we do see the signs that thyroid is going to be decreasing. I haven't seen research actually specifically pointing to that, but we're activating the same mechanisms that typically lower thyroid hormone, which is the sympathetic nervous system, that stress system. That's what turns down thyroid hormone production and conversion. So I would expect to see those things with time. And we do also see, I should say in the research, decreased metabolic rate. So initially it increases, there's this bump in energy expenditure, which for us could be months. You might not notice it, just like with fasting or low carb, this might go fine for months or even longer. But then after that, we do see the opposite. We see that metabolic rate go down, which again is mediated by thyroid, among other things.
Wouldn't it go along with acute stress versus chronic stress? I mean, if someone goes through a divorce or has a death in the family, it's very common to lose weight short term, but then they start gaining the weight because of the chronic stress and the stress hormones that are staying elevated long term. It sounds like it would follow the same pattern because you're giving that initial acute stress, and then long term, it's like, hey, wait a second. We're in this new reality where I'm only getting these macronutrients and I've got to shut things down for survival mode. So it just seems like they all follow the same pattern.
Yeah. And it comes back to where we started, right? Low calorie dieting and over exercising will do the same thing. You see the weight loss, and then all of a sudden we were maintaining our weight, let's say on 2,500 calories before. Then we went into this big deficit to lose body fat. And then now we try to go back up to the 2,500 and we'd be gaining a lot of weight. We can only maintain on 2,000 calories or 2,200. And then that keeps going down with time and our weight keeps going up despite that. So we're left in that same in that same result, in the long term.
Okay, so Jay, if we're not going to do keto and we're not necessarily going to go the extreme sugar diet, what does work for fat loss? And what are you promoting? What do your clients see their success with?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the way that I look at it, my perspective on it is we want fat loss to be the byproduct of improved health, which is the byproduct of better energy production, right? So if we fix our ability to convert that fuel to energy and we have abundant ATP available for everything to function well and we increase our metabolic rate, all of a sudden that fuel, instead of getting stored as body fat, is now getting used to produce energy. And we don't have as much going into the body fat. We always have some coming out. That's just a normal part of the process. And so we can actually see that body fat loss as a result of our health, as opposed to that being the primary goal, which almost always comes at the cost of our health. So that's the framework that I would want to consider. And the, I guess, unfortunate part about that is it's not as simple as just saying, here's this straight diet where you just cut this one macronutrient out, or you just cut out these foods and everything else falls into place. Because the reality is the reason why one person might not be converting fuel to energy effectively might be different from someone else. Psychological stress could be a big part of it. Impaired gut health could be a big part of it. insomnia could be a driver. I mean, there's so many different things to consider. And, are we dealing with nutrient deficiencies? Are we eating foods that we don't digest well? I mean, we need to consider all those things. One of the biggest ones, which I didn't even mention yet, is the polyunsaturated fats, the PUFA, which are in the seed oils and some other places as well. And those are massively downregulating our metabolism. They drive us toward that hibernation state that we were talking about. So my approach is to look at ourselves as individuals and figure out where are our symptoms, like what are the main issues that we're having, what's our diet looking like, what sort of nutrient deficiencies might we be dealing with, and fixing those things individually as we go. I think there's a place for decreasing fat intake, for example. We kind of touched on this earlier, where if somebody is in that very overweight or obese category, there's a lot of fat being released from the fat stores through a process called lipolysis due to chronically high stress hormones. So there's already a lot of fat available, and that's kind of out competing the carbohydrate metabolism. So in a case like that, eating less fat can actually improve our insulin resistance. It can allow us to utilize the carbs better, and that can be a tool that helps us get to a better place. But that doesn't always have to be the case, right? As we talked about earlier, endotoxin is a major driver of that state. And if we are able to clear out some of those harmful bacteria and stop eating foods that are feeding them, we might not need to lower the fat at all, and we might see improvements in insulin sensitivity and see the weight start to come down. So there's a place for considering these kinds of tools. I will say it's nearly never that a low protein diet would be one of those tools I would consider. Maybe if someone's dealing with some kidney issues, kidney disease, that's a situation where there could be some issues processing the high amounts of protein. That doesn't mean that eating large amounts of protein causes that. That's, I think, a large misconception. But if that disease has already progressed, then that can be a state where in the process of trying to reverse it, decreasing protein intake can help. But I think we need to consider ourselves as a whole and recognize the complexity and nuance and intelligence that our bodies have. Try not to go a restricting route, but rather a supporting route where we're providing our bodies with what they actually need and taking away the things that are kind of constantly pressing on the brakes. And that will then allow us to see things like better energy and sleep and digestion and hormones, and then the weight loss will follow.
Yeah, I love that you said it's not just about what we're eating, but it's about what we're not eating and the toxins. And when I say diet, it's the environmental diet. What are you putting on your skin? What are you washing your hair with? What air are you breathing? What water are you drinking? Is there fluoride in your water? It's all the things. It's not just the calories, the fat, the protein and the carbs. I mean, I'm laughing because there's a protein bar out there that it says it's very low fat, very high protein. It looks super clean. And I was eating them and I'm thinking, and I'm usually not a bar person. I usually just focus on whole food. And I thought, no, I'm going to try this. It tastes really good. And after about a couple of days, I started getting really bloated and constipated. And I look at it and it has this fat in it that's engineered so it doesn't get digested. And you're thinking, that's not real food. Like, I mean, you can't get around the fact that that is not real food. And what is the body going to do to it? It's going to say, hey, I don't recognize what this is. And right?
Yeah, well, and all you have to do is think one step after. So it's just so ridiculous, right? Someone says, hey, we're eating too many calories. That's the problem. Forget what's actually going on physiologically. We're just eating too much. And so let's make it so that we can eat the same amount, but there's actually less that gets absorbed, right? So we're absorbing less of the fat. Think about what happens one step after. The fat doesn't get absorbed, so it keeps going down the intestines. And guess what's really irritating to the large intestine? Undigested fat. Yeah. It's super well known. That's not a secret. Anybody like who is familiar with digestive health knows that poorly digested fats are really irritating to the large intestine, cause inflammation, cause intestinal permeability. And so obviously if you're engineering a fat that you can't digest and having people consume that, it is going to cause that problem. And what an amazing example of how reductionist the calories in, calories out sort of approach is, and what you can end up with as a result. That's I mean, it's just ignore every part of physiology and
Exactly.
ignore the fact that when you have intestinal inflammation and intestinal permeability as a result of that, you're then going to be in a more inflamed state. You will be absorbing more endotoxin, and that'll block your ability to produce energy anyway. So you're just downregulating your metabolism even further, not to mention all of the other irritation and problems that you've caused digestively. So
Right.
yeah, that's crazy.
Well, and then if you've downregulated your energy and your metabolism, the cravings are going to go up because you're going to be going, I need more food to create more energy. And that's where the cravings start coming in. And so one of the biggest takeaways is I focus on protein because it calms my brain down and it tells me I'm safe. I've got enough. I don't need to crave more. So it shuts down the cravings. And then you actually have this real relationship with food. And you're not going to binge on a baked potato with salt, right? You're going to binge on the Pringles that is 3 baked potatoes, but you're not going to binge on more than 1 baked potato. And you're not going to binge on a bison ribeye steak. You're not going to binge on the healthy vegetables that work for your body or even fruit. Yeah, you might drink a ton of fruit juice maybe, but you know, when nature is giving you the fiber with the fruit and the nutrients, you're not going to eat 10 oranges at once. And so there's this natural mechanism of saying, okay, I'm full, I've had enough. But when you go out and you have orange sherbet that has the same calories as 10 oranges, you could eat 3 servings of it because of what it's doing to the brain and the body, and you're not getting the nutrients your body's craving. So you're just going to continue craving until your body registers that you're getting those whole nutrients and minerals that it needs for good, efficient energy. So am I missing anything there?
No, that's spot on. And I think there's 2 really key things to look at here. So one is a deficiency of any of those macronutrients will cause cravings for it through independent mechanisms. If we have a protein deficiency, we're going to crave protein. If we have a carb deficiency, we'll crave carbohydrates, and same with fat. So that's one thing to consider. But the other thing, as we were getting at, is the biggest determinant of our hunger is energy availability. So there are these sensors in our liver and in our brain in the hypothalamus that basically say, if there's not enough ATP here, you should keep eating. It upregulates those hunger signals, or doesn't downregulate the hunger signals, even if we've eaten. So what that essentially means is that if you're eating things that you don't effectively convert to energy, you're still going to be hungry, even though you've quote unquote eaten enough, and it's going to drive you to keep eating. Whereas instead, if you're actually eating foods that are made of good ingredients and you're effectively converting fuel to energy, then even if it is, let's say, a sherbet that's made with good ingredients, then I don't think overeating is even a concern in that state if you're generally eating enough of all the macronutrients, you have a well-balanced diet, and we're efficiently converting fuel to energy. But instead, we're in a state where we're already metabolically impaired, and then you go to eat some ice cream, those hunger signals are not properly regulated because you're already not converting fuel to energy properly, and that's when we get binging and quote-unquote overeating. But I can't tell you how many people who I've worked with who have told me that they thought they had a sugar addiction, they thought they had a binging disorder, binge eating disorder, those kinds of things. And the reality was they were just undernourished, underfed, and had a lack of energy.
Yep.
And when we fixed those things, they were able to eat a bit of the ice cream, a portion of it, and put the container away instead of just eating the whole thing. And so many examples that are similar to that. So I think, and obviously this is like ice cream with good ingredients, we're not talking about most of what's out there, but when we're talking milk, eggs, some sugar, and maybe some fruit or something in the ice cream, I'm not too concerned about that in the context of a healthy individual. So
yeah, I mean, use your ninja and make your own ice cream, right?
Yeah, that too.
Well, Jay, another amazing time with you. I can't believe we're out of time. And for all of you who want more details on the sugar diet, Jay's got some great podcasts on his channel for those explaining the science behind it, getting really deep. You're going to have to listen to him over and over again to really understand the mechanisms. But Jay, where can people find you and work with you?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Sarah. So we talked around a lot of different aspects of the diet, but I think it's really helpful when people just have a straightforward guide that says, here are the foods that are most supportive of my metabolism and are going to help me produce energy and help me with the weight loss. Here are the foods that are not and that we want to avoid. And then also with all the digestive symptoms people have, it's helpful to also know which ones are most likely to be triggering those and causing those problems that we talked about might get resolved on something like low carb or keto, but we want to be able to resolve them without those. So I put a guide together called the Energy Balance Food Guide that listeners can download for free at jayfeldmanwellness.com/guide. And it goes through all that, lays it out in a nice infographic for people to be able to take a look at and implement a lot of what we discussed here practically and easily.
Amazing. And your food guide really aligns with what I promote. So I am all about your food guide. So thanks, Jay. And we will definitely have you back because you are always on the cutting edge of everything science-based, and you know your stuff. So thanks again for coming.
Great. Well, thanks so much for having me, Sarah.
You know, as Jay and I were talking, fat loss and weight loss is a huge deal now. And if you just stick to the real food, like our ancestors or even our grandparents and parents ate, there wouldn't be an issue. And so we're all trying to make these hacks of eliminating this and eliminating that. And really it comes down to caloric restriction, but then that's a stressor on the body, and then the body slows its metabolic rate, and it backfires. And then you're stuck at a lower metabolic rate where you can't even lose weight eating less or doing that diet that got you there in that short term. But what we did talk about that is overlooked is that health of the liver. If you are not having or living with a healthy liver and you are bombarded by those toxins, the microplastics, the heavy metals, the glyphosate, all these things that we're being hit with, and your liver can't do its function, it won't be able to process protein, assimilate it. It won't be able to process fats. Cholesterol levels go up. Thyroid conversion goes down. So your T4 doesn't convert into T3. That's why we're seeing so much hypothyroidism in people that had healthy metabolic rates for so long. So what do? Well, for your liver, that's where that accelerated liver care comes in. It's a comprehensive blend of 13 potent herbs. It saved my liver last fall. My liver enzymes were over 700. Crazy. They need to be under 20. Within 2.5 weeks, my liver enzymes came down with the accelerated liver care. It is designed to rejuvenate the liver function, enhance detoxification. The formula includes TUGCA, which you probably heard about. It's known for its ability to support that bile flow that Jay was talking about, reduce liver inflammation. It has milk thistle, which helps with the liver cell regeneration. Andrographis and philanthus work synergistically to combat that oxidative stress and support liver health. Then we've put in there Eclipta and stone breaking, buplarium, and they have been used to promote bile production and liver detoxification. And then there's some others like Palperera that you've never heard of that is known to help with cancer and cirrhosis. So things that so many people are suffering from, and there's this downstream symptom of weight gain and brain fog and insulin resistance because your liver is not functioning. And your liver is where the food is then translated into that energy. And Jay talks about that chasm between what you're taking in versus what your body is getting out of the fuel it's taking in. So accelerated liver care is really helpful. And when you add in the accelerated thyroid and the acceleradine iodine, the 1-2 punch for your thyroid health to boost up the fat burning, the metabolic rate, and just all the things that are related to thyroid, your adrenal health, your sex hormones, libido, hair growth, skin, all the things, you're going to see your food translate into energy and you're going to feel better. So hopefully that was helpful. Thanks for tuning in today to Sara, Accelerated Health with Sara Banta. I hope you learned something and you were inspired. Head to SaraBantaHealth.com for health articles. Join the free group coaching on Telegram. The link's there, and you can find the supplements we talked about at acceleratedhealthproducts.com using coupon podcast10 for your first order. If you loved what you heard today and you really got something out of it, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, share it with someone who needs it. This will help this podcast reach more people like you. Remember, I'm live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, so join me next time for more ways to unlock your health potential.